Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are back and we are continuing with our Road to the Candidates series. Now, to give you guys an update on where things stand, I need to play 11 classical FIDE rated games before the end of the year to qualify for the 2026 Candidates Tournament by rating. Now, you're probably wondering, where am I going to go next? Now, one big issue that I noticed, even though I've been looking for tournaments over the last month or so, I would say, not a couple of months, is that there are very, very few tournaments that have 6 rounds. Now, I need 11 games. There are plenty of tournaments in the United States that have 5 rounds featuring 3 games on a Saturday and 2 games on a Sunday. But as I need 6 games, I have to find somewhere where there is a holiday. Now, those of you guys who are watching my video from the US specifically, you might be a little bit surprised to know that our neighbors up north here in Canada actually celebrate Thanksgiving before us. As such, I noticed there were a couple of tournaments this weekend over the Canadian Thanksgiving. There was one in British Columbia, a place that I really, really love and enjoy. And then I noticed there was this small 6-round tournament being played here in Prince Edward Island. So ultimately, I made the decision to play here in Prince Edward Island because having traveled far and wide across Canada, having been in Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Ontario many times, I thought, why not head to Nova Scotia and then on to Prince Edward Island? All right, so that's a lot to do about nothing, but let's jump right into the action. Now, this event is a 6-round tournament. It is FIDE rated, 90 minutes plus 30 seconds. And in the first round, I'm playing against women's FIDE master Michelle Zhang from Nova Scotia, who is all of 12 years old. Now, one of the dangers of playing in these tournaments is that in places like Canada, if you're in some of these regions that don't have a lot of chess activity, you can potentially be underrated. So seeing my first round opponent, I was a little bit worried, I should say. Maybe not worried, but I thought my opponent might play higher than her rating. And let's get into the action. So the game starts with the move e4. I play c5, we get knight f3, and I play the move e6. We get d4, I take, and now I play the move a6. Now this, of course, is the classic Khan setup here with the pawns on e6 and a6, and now we get the move bishop to d3. Here I decide to play the move g6. Now when I played the move g6, this was in the spirit of the former United States chess champion Gata Kamsky. He actually played these systems with g6 quite frequently in the past, and so I thought, why not play it against somebody and have some fun? Additionally, it's not a main line, so I thought it might take my opponent by surprise. So we get the move castles. I play bishop g7, knight b3, and now I play the move knight to e7. Now here, after a short think, we get the move knight d2, I play castles, and now we get the move a4. Now at this point already, I was a little bit concerned about the position because even though I've taken my young opponent out of book here, it looks like she has a very concrete plan with playing for a5 and knight c4 to hook a knight on b6 or to jump to d6 with the knight. So here I play the move knight to c6. Initially, I did consider d5, which is a top computer line, but after the move a5, I simply didn't see a clear-cut plan, so I thought, let's develop naturally. So we get a5. Now I play the move d5 here. This move is almost forced at this point because if I play a move like d6, after knight to c4, suddenly the pawn on d6 is weak. The knight is jumping to b6 with a classic outpost, and it's looking really, really bad for me. So I decide to play d5, stopping knight c4, and now we get the move pawn to c3. After c3, I play knight to e5, we get bishop e2, and here I play the move queen c7. Now at this point, I was already up about 25 minutes on the clock, and because I was up so much time, I started feeling this need to try and put pressure on the clock, and I played queen c7 very quickly. Now what's worth noting here is that while my opponent was thinking, I actually was intending to play the move b5 against bishop e2 and against bishop c2 to play the move queen c7. So I confused my order, and as soon as we saw this move bishop to e2 being played, I instantly played queen c7, and in my mind, I realized that I had confused the variations. What I should have played was the move b5 here, and after pawn takes, queen takes with the idea of bishop to b7 here, putting the bishop on the long diagonal, I think black should have no problems whatsoever. But I go queen c7, and now we get the move f4, I play knight c6, and here we get the move pawn to e5. Now I play b6, trying to get rid of this pawn on a5, and in this position, we get the move knight to f3. Here I play the move pawn takes pawn, and now we get the move bishop to e3. Sorry about a little bit of distraction, but I think the AC might have just turned on, so I apologize if there's some extra noise on this recording. So we get bishop e3, and now I play the move rook to b8, and already here I was actually feeling some pressure. I was a little bit nervous because even though the position is okay for me, my young opponent has played very, very well up to this point. She's shown good understanding of the pawn structure. She did not actually take the pawn on b6, which is what I expected. So I already was wondering how I was going to perhaps trick her and win the game. So we get the move rook to b1. Now I play the move knight to f5, bishop f2, and here I play the move f6. And this move is actually okay, but I was kind of unhappy with this decision at the time. I think bishop to h6 might be a little bit better here, pressuring the pawn, because after g3, I might have time to play rook to d8 here. But ultimately, I end up going f6, trying to open up the center of the board. We get pawn takes, I take, we get knight to d4, and this move is probably a serious mistake here. And I must point out that after the move g3, I wasn't sure why I should even be better. Even though I'm up a pawn here, white's going to put a knight on d4 here, and I think that it's very hard to prove the advantage. So instead we get knight d4. I take, we get takes, and now I take, we get takes, and here I play the move knight takes bishop. Now I spent a lot of time over the course of these next 2 to 3 moves, because at this point, one of the things I had to figure out is whether my opponent, how strong is she? Now, there are a couple traps I laid along the way in this game. For example, way back when I played this move b6, I thought she would take. She didn't take, which I think was the correct decision. So here she showed really, really good understanding to not take the pawn. This was the first trap that I laid. The next trap that I laid was right here when I took. And I was expecting my opponent to play pawn takes bishop here, because now if I were to play a move like queen f4, after bishop g3, queen to e3, and bishop to f2, white should not be worse. Now, she didn't play this, whether it's because she didn't calculate this because of where she is rating-wise, or whether she actually didn't see it. These were 2 very obvious traps where I was testing the water to see what she would do, and she did not fall for either of these. So based on that, I spent a lot of time here before going for this endgame with knight takes bishop and queen b6, because I really considered taking the pawn on f4. But the problem with taking this pawn on f4 here is that after white goes bishop c5, even though I have 2 extra pawns on the board here, white has the 2 b's. I've got a lot of dark square weaknesses near my king, and with these active bishops, potentially the f-file open, and having laid these traps which she didn't fall for, I basically was showing her respect here and believing that I couldn't gamble much further and take a huge risk. So as such, I decided to trade the queens, go into this endgame as the queens will come off. We get the move takes, and now we get the move g3. Here I played the move bishop b7, and this is a move that I think is wrong. I think I should have played bishop to d7 here, followed by rook to b8, creating the double stack. I think the reason I didn't play this move is I thought that white could go c4 here, and after rook f8, I thought takes, and bishop f3 was fine, but apparently after rook b2, takes, and king to f8 here, with these double pawns which are pushing up the board here, apparently black is simply much better. But instead I go bishop b7, and the reason I play this move is I was really trying to stop the c4 pawn push. So you get the move bishop g4, and now I play rook c8. This is a move that I should not have played here, by the way. Again, I should have probably have gone rook to b8, immediately pressuring this pawn on b2. But I go rook c8 here. My idea was I thought I could put the rook on c5, swing it to b5, all while stopping this pawn thrust with c4. So we get rook e1, king f7, rook a1, and now I play rook c5 guarding the pawn. We get rook to e2, and here I play the move bishop c8. Now there's nothing wrong with this move per se, but it's simply a little bit too slow. At this point, I should have really been trying to force the issue with a move like rook to b5, because after rook to a2 is played here, now I can go d4, takes, and after bishop to d5, let's just say white goes rook to a3, for example. After takes, I have check, king f1, and after rook takes h2, black should be significantly better. But I played bishop c8, and I think this is something that probably, if I were playing a little bit of a stronger player, I would not have done. I would have felt the urgency, but I figured against a lower rated player, I have all the time in the world, and sooner or later, a mistake is going to happen. But as we're about to see, a mistake will not happen for a very long time. We get king f2, I play king f6, rook a3, g5, and now we got the move rook a4. Now, I think at this point, it would have been more prudent to play h4 here, stopping this pawn break with g5, because after rook to b5 and rook to a2, white is still guarding this pawn on b2 with both of these rooks. But instead, we get rook a3, g5, rook a4, I take, and now I go king e7, and here we got the move rook d4. Now, what's interesting about this position is the computer actually gives black a very significant advantage here, but I did not actually think I was much better at this point in the game, because even though I'm up a pawn, it's a double pawn here. There's a lot of pressure toward these central pawns. Also, white can always guard the pawn on b2. So even though the computer loves it, I actually was kind of worried that I might not win already. So I go king d6. We get the move bishop to f3, and now I play bishop d7, we get rook d2, and here I play the move king c7. Now this move is a terrible decision here. I should have played rook to b5, and this was actually my original intention, but I spotted this very tricky move, pawn to b3 here, where if I take, white can sack a bishop, and suddenly white out of nowhere is completely fine. And after b3, I did not see a good continuation. I moved the king. I thought that white could play c4 here, and after takes, I thought that this was okay for white. Apparently I have rook b2, and with the pawns pushing, again, this is a big advantage. But I think this kind of goes to show how I was underestimating my position at this point in the game, because I was already very concerned. So instead I go king c7. Now this move is simply too slow, because we get to move bishop to e2, stopping the double stack on the b file. And now with white having ideas like rook to h4, I was seriously in my mind thinking, is this going to be a draw? So I go bishop to e8. We got c4 here, and now I play pawn takes pawn. This is a mistake. I should probably go king d6, but after takes e5 and say a move like rook to h4, I guess I can take this pawn on d5, and I'm still better. But I was already starting to lose my mind a little bit here, and I was feeling this need to try and win on the clock. So I take. We get the trade. I play the move a4 here, and now we got the move king e3. I go e5. We get rook c2. King d6, and now we have the move h4. Now this move is a mistake here. If white is going to push the pawns, white should probably push g4 and h4 here, because when white plays the move h4, there's always a potential that I'm going to be able to blockade these pawns going up the board. So I go king e7. We get rook to d2, and now I play the move rook g6, and here we get king f2. Now note that my opponent is down to 4 minutes on the clock here, so she's starting to feel the pressure. In this situation, had she played the move rook to d5 here, attacking the pawn on e5, after takes and the move king to d2, I am not winning in this position. With the pawns on a6 and e5 under attack here, this position should be a draw. If I go king f6, there's check, and then king f5, white can simply go bishop d3, and after e4, white can sack, and this is going to be a draw, even though I have an extra pawn, simply because these pawns are all on the edge of the board. But we get king f2. Now I play rook to c6, we get bishop e2, and here I play the move rook to b6. Now we get the move bishop to d1, I go rook b4, and here we get the move king to e3. Now this move is a mistake here. A better try would have been to play g4 here, trying to create the counterplay on the king side, because even though I have this extra pawn in the center of the board, it's not really going anywhere if I ever go e4. After king to e3, both the pawn on a4 and the pawn on e4 are weak, and white has a 2-on-1 on the king side here, so white, if anything, should be better. But we get king to e3. I go bishop to f7 here, we get h5, and now I play the move h6. Now this h5 move does not necessarily lead to a loss for white, but once I'm able to fix this pawn on the light square here, and white will not be able to create a passed pawn on the king side, it becomes a very, very difficult task, and now things start to fall apart. We got the move bishop e2. I play a5 here, we got rook c2, and now I play the move bishop to e6, stopping the pawn from moving forward here while keeping pressure on b2. We get rook to c5. This move does effectively lose the game here. Probably the only way to continue is to play g4, but after king to d6, rook to d2, and bishop to d5, this is very, very tough for white to play. If white plays bishop f3, I can simply play the move rook to b3, and after king to e2 here, I have rook takes f3, takes, and now after king to e6, black is actually winning in this king and pawn endgame. So we get rook c5. I play the check, and now after rook takes b2, with the pin of the bishop and the king here on the second rank, and this p that's going up the board on the queen side here, now the game is actually in a situation where I'm going to win. We get rook takes a5, I play bishop c4 here, taking advantage of the bishop, and now we get the move rook takes a4. If rook takes e5 had been played after king f6, rook to e3, I can simply trade off everything here on e2, and after a3, king d2, and a2, my pawn simply gets through, it promotes, becomes a queen, and I win the game. So as soon as I got to this position with bishop c4, I finally breathed a sigh of relief, because my opponent has put up tremendous resistance this entire game, and even if I missed some opportunities, I felt like I laid a lot of traps, and until this final moment, she actually was holding her own. So we get rook takes pawn. I take the bishop, we get king e3, and after bishop takes h5, rook h4, I go bishop g6, takes, check, and now after move king to f6 with a pawn on the board and just a clean extra bishop, the rest is very simple. We get rook h1, e4, I go bishop h5, intending to push the pawn forward here with the bishop and the rook supporting it. We get rook c6, g4, go king f6, king f5, and here my young opponent resigns the game, because if white plays rook e3, I'll just trade into this endgame with the pawn going up the board. If white moves the king, I can simply push the pawn forward, and there's just no way that I'm not going to win. So after this king to f5 move, my opponent resigns here, and I get a very big win in the first round. Now, I gained 0 points for this win because my opponent is rated 1917 FIDE. I think this shows one of the flaws with the rating system at the moment, because it's very clear to me that my opponent was much stronger than 1900. I feel like she played at least at a 2000, not a 2100 plus level. Sure, I missed some opportunities, but she did not make any serious blunders until I think it was move number 50, move number 52. So she made some mistakes, but no serious errors until move number 52. And so she's clearly much stronger than 1917. And I do hope that my opponent has the opportunity to play some more turns against stronger players to improve her experiences and, of course, gain some rating points as well. So I really can breathe a sigh of relief after winning this first round. And now let's jump to the second round of the day. Now, one thing that was really annoying about the first round going so long and my opponent putting up so much resistance is that it meant that I was trying to play an online event in between the games, also known as the Comet Open, which has a grand prize of $45,000. So I played in this event trying to qualify for the grand finals next weekend. Unfortunately, I spotted my opponent's half an hour in the 2-hour arena. I would tie for fourth, which normally would be good enough to qualify, but unfortunately I finished 6th on tiebreak, which meant that I did not qualify for the finals. It also meant that I was playing non-stop Blitz online right up until the second round of the day. So in the second round, I have the white pieces against Titan Dunahee, another Canadian player. His FIDE rating is 1808, but his actual Canadian rating is 2100. So I was aware that I had another opponent who likely was underrated in this situation. So I have the white pieces. I open with e4 here, we get e5, and now I decide to play the move bishop c4. We get knight f6, and I go d3. Now this, of course, is the classic bishop's opening with e4, d3, and bishop c4. You develop this bishop immediately before you develop any of the other minor pieces. So we get c6, knight f3, d5, bishop b3, and now we get the move bishop to d6. Now black does have this big black center here, but with this bishop targeting the pawn and this knight targeting this pawn on e5, the position is relatively balanced. So here I decide to castle. Now, it's worth pointing out that I was a little bit annoyed by the events leading right into this game that happened in the online tournament, so my mind wasn't completely there, and I think that's what led to this very, very bad decision to castle in this position. Now, originally I was going to play a move like knight c3 or maybe a queen to e2, but I just decided why not castle? We get castles. And now I play the move knight to c3. Now, this move that I played was based on a complete misunderstanding of the position. One thing I've known from past games is that after white plays knight c3 here, for example, and black goes d4 and knight to e2, and black plays c5, after something like castles, knight g3, and knight c6, I guess the engine is actually a little bit weak on this computer, but I know that black is doing relatively well if they know how to defend this position. But that was in my mind. So when I played knight c3, I was expecting d4, and then as soon as d takes e4 was played, I was like, uh-oh, we're in a situation where I'm playing a much lower rated player, and we're going to have a symmetrical pawn structure. So I take with the knight. Now I could play pawn takes, but after knight to a6 here, trying to jump with the knight towards the center to pressure the pawn and the bishop at the same time, I'm not really sure what I'm doing. So I go knight takes e4. Now this means that we have one set of knights off the board, and we have a symmetrical pawn structure here. Already here I was thinking to myself, wow. So after the first game where I had this really tough battle, suddenly around 2 I'm thinking, wait, is this going to be a draw? Am I going to actually draw this game as opposed to the first one? So we got h6 here. And in this position, I played the move knight to e1, and this is simply a terrible move. What I should have played here was knight to h4, trying to jump with the knight towards either f5 or g6 here, f5 or g6. And if black were to take the knight, after queen takes bishop, let's say black plays queen e4 here. I think after bishop takes h6, let's say black takes, and white plays rook e1. With all these threats, all the pieces in the middle of the board here, white is apparently winning the game. So I spent a bit of time here. I actually spent like 4 minutes before playing knight e1, and knight e1 is simply a ridiculous move. There's no way of getting around it. My explanation for why I play this is in my mind, I was still thinking about this online event. I was in a pretty bad mood, and I just thought, okay, whatever, just play a move. So I should have played knight h4, but I go knight to e1. And this also is a bit of hope chess in a sense. One of the big drawbacks of playing lower rated players is sometimes you hope they won't see an idea. Now, when I played knight e1, I was thinking to myself, there's no way my opponent's going to play knight to a6. My opponent could have played knight a6 all the way back here. My opponent could have played knight a6 here. My opponent also could have played something like d4 and then knight a6 again, or a5 and knight a6. A lot of different options to play knight a6. So in my mind, I'm thinking to myself, well, my opponent's not going to play knight a6. So knight e1, knight d3 is fine. And then we get knight a6. And as soon as knight a6 is on the board, I'm thinking to myself, you're such an idiot. What are you doing? You don't know what you're doing at all. So I go knight d3, we get knight c5. Now I play rook to e1, trying to guard the pawn, and here we get the move knight takes knight on d3. Now, if I were playing someone who were a grandmaster, they for sure would have played knight takes bishop here and played this position with something like queen to c7, or maybe an idea like f5 here. And with black having the two b's, black is actually better. Not only do you have the two b's, white has double pawns as well, and this is simply a dream. So this really highlights the issue with playing these lower rated players. And this is why I actually have some issue when people are like, oh, it's so easy, you win all these games in a super simple manner. Because the fact of the matter is I have to take liberties, I have to take chances and do things that I normally would not do. And that actually, if anything, makes it very stressful and very difficult when I play these lower rated players. Last we get knight takes knight, and now I play the move queen takes knight, and here we get a shocking blunder with the move bishop c5. Now, I initially was thinking that my opponent could play bishop b4 here, targeting the rook and offering the exchange of the queens. And let's say I play like rook d1, for example, and we get the trade of the queens here. Maybe white is very slightly better, but it's nothing to write home about. But I realized that after bishop b4, I could play this move bishop takes f7, checking the king. If you take, I take the queen. And if you take, I have check, and then I take the bishop on b4. So as soon as I spotted that bishop b4, bishop f7 was in play, I figured my opponent would see it, and then he would not put the bishop on c5 because he would have seen what happens after bishop b4. Alas, lady luck was on my side. We get bishop c5 on the board, and this move loses the game because it allows me to go bishop takes f7, checking the king. Same issue. If you take with the bishop, you give up the queen. Take with the king, I check, and then I take the bishop and win the game. And so we get the move king to h8. Now I can trade, and I go bishop to e3. And at this point, I simply have an extra pawn on the king side. With all the material on the board here, this should be pretty straightforward. So we got the trade, rook to d2 with the kebab, trying to impale all the pawns on the second rank. I go rook c1 guarding, bishop g4, and now I play the move f3, building the chain of 3. We get rook to f8, I drop the bishop back, and now we get the move bishop to h5. Now, probably what should have been played was bishop to c8 here, and after rook d3, takes, and let's just say, I think I should take with the bishop or the pawn. Maybe pawn takes is actually better. Perhaps black should play, I was going to say rook to d8 is best, but after takes and bishop d3 with white bringing the king to the center, able to push the pawns here on the king side, this should be a pretty straightforward technical win. Now, the reason I mention this is because after we get bishop to h5 and I go king to f1, now we get to move bishop f7, and at this point, from a technical standpoint, the game is basically over. The reason it's over is I can trade and play rook to d3, and now we get rook to d7. If black were to trade the rooks on d3 here after, say, rook to e7 and b4, king g8, and king e2, eventually white is going to push either the f pawn or the d pawn. Combined with this minority attack of the pawns, the two pawns here that restrict these three black pawns, this is all but hopeless. So we get the move rook to d7. I trade, I go king e2, and you'll notice here that I spent a lot of time on the last two moves, and the reason is because as soon as bishop f7 was played, I was already thinking about this looming endgame here, where I go rook to d1. Now, the reason I spent so much time is that I was double checking to make sure that this king and pawn endgame is winning, because in this situation with such limited material, only pawns on the board, if I miscalculate, my opponent, if he sees the right sequence of moves, he can draw this game. This is very simple. It's literally move by move. There isn't anything to think about other than moving the king or moving the pawns. So the reason I spent so much time is because I was trying to make sure that this endgame was actually winning. One of the ghosts that I saw here, something like c3, g4, and after, or actually I should say, let's set up. Say I go, let's say I go like, I guess a3, c5, a4, c4, king e2. Is if we get some endgame like this, I thought maybe it's going to end up in a draw. Ultimately, it doesn't exist, but I still thought there's some chance. Like, actually, is this one a draw? If this one is a draw, but I guess here it's still actually winning for white. But I saw these possibilities, and since it's so far out at this point, when I go rook d1, I have to calculate all these lines. Now, ultimately, as you saw from the valuation bar, it is winning because I can create a passed pawn. But I spent a lot of time looking at it. Now, as soon as I spent all those 20 minutes looking, immediately we got rook e7. I'm like, okay, why did I just waste 30 minutes thinking if rook e7 is going to be played immediately? So I go rook to d6 here, king g7, and now I play b4, trying to restrict the black pawns from pushing up the board. We get king h7, a4, a5, a6 here. If black goes king h7, I can simply go a6, and in this situation, I'm going to win on the queen side. So we get a6 here to stop me from pushing forward, but the problem with this move is that now it gives me a straight path for the king to start marching forward. So I go h3, h5, now king to d3 here. The reason for this is that when g4 is on the board, now I've eliminated any pawns on the h or the g file, so the king is marching forward, and now it's pretty straightforward. Now, if my opponent were to not go g4, say you get h4, the king just keeps marching forward here, and eventually I'm going to play something like rook d8, rook b8, win the pawn, and all these pawns are going to collapse, and white is going to win the game. So you get g4, I take twice, now I go rook to e6, winning the pawn on e5, we get takes, check, rook b7, and now both these pawns are under attack. We got king e5, check, rook a7, takes, rook a6, and now at the end of the day, I have 3 extra pawns here on the board. This is straightforward. So we got the move king c7, I go rook e7, g1, rook c1. Of course, I could have played king c5 here, marching the king forward and then pushing the p on the a file. I decided instead to play c3. We got c5, b5. Even b takes c5 wins, but now I have 2 unimpeded pass pawns rushing up the board on the a and b files, and I have a 3rd pass pawn as well. So with 3 pawns going up the board, the wide peoples will win the game. We got rook a1, a6, rook a3, e5, e6, king b8, and now I play the move rook to b7. This was me having a little bit of fun here. Pretty much everything wins, but when I go rook b7 and king a8, for a split second, my opponent thought he might be able to make a draw here by stalemate because the king has no squares available, but as he realized pretty much in a couple of seconds, after we get the move rook to a4, I simply go to d5. I do not take this pawn, because after rook to c4, maybe this is still somehow winning, but it's very, very tricky here. I guess I can hide the king somehow. I go here, here. Oh, and if check, I can take, and it's game over. But if I ever take this rook, for example, it's stalemate because the king cannot move in this situation as the rook covers both the squares. But after rook to a4, I go king d5. I leave nothing to chance. King b3, by the way, would actually lead to a forced draw, because after c4, if I take, black has no moves. King can't move anywhere. And if I go king c2, after check, black will just basically offer the rook, doesn't matter where I go on this back rank. And sooner or later, I have to eat the rook, and once again, the king has no moves. So I can't go to b3. King d3 would also win, because if black plays rook d4, after takes, check, and king to e2, the pawn can move forward, and then again, I promote and win the game. But I decided to just go to d5, and here my opponent decides to resign, because after rook to d4, I can simply take, and the pawn can push forward. Even frankly, king to e5 would win. Everything wins here because his pawn still has a square on c4 to move to. So after king to d5, I get what turns into a very, very easy and smooth victory in the second game of the day. It would have been very interesting to see what would have happened had my opponent not blundered with bishop to c5, because the position was incredibly equal at that moment in the game. As I mentioned very briefly when I spoke to my opponent afterwards, if black plays queen to e7 or maybe queen to f6, it should be okay. I'm kind of surprised that the valuation bar here is giving, or the eval bar is giving white a 0.29 advantage, because I thought this was very close to 0.00 with the symmetrical pawn structure, everything being symmetrical, and only queens and bishops on the board, no knights. But apparently white is actually a little bit better after bishop e3. But anyway, it would have been very interesting to see how the game would have progressed if bishop c5 hadn't been played. Alas, it was, and I went on to a very, very smooth and easy victory in the second game of the day. Now, this means that I've completed now 2 more games in our quest to reach the candidates. This means that I have 9 games remaining. The only downside to this is that FIDE recently changed the rules, so even though I've won these 2 hard-fought games, I'm gaining 0.0 points, meaning that my rating has not changed at all. But as I've said from the start of this whole series of getting to the candidates, it's not about the rating. It's not about farming. It's about getting the games in, and we've now knocked out 2 more games. We have 4 more games this weekend, and after that, we'll have 5 left. 5 more final games and a tournament yet to be determined. But at any rate, it's 2 more games down, and that's going to do it for our first recap of 3 from this Maritime Open here in Prince Edward Island. I realized I didn't say that yet, the name of the tournament. So this is our first recap from the Maritime Open here in Prince Edward Island. I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, make sure that you smash that subscribe button below, and we'll be back with a recap tomorrow after rounds 3 and 4 of this tournament. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a great rest of your evening, and I'll see you tomorrow. See you guys. Bye.